And good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Anike Coates. I am the Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships at Associated Black Charities, and honored to welcome you to the second installment of Equity First, ABC's new speaker series for 2021. Equity First consists of interviews with key leaders from Baltimore and across the nation who recognize that sustainable change for people of color will only come when structural and institutional barriers are replaced with equitable policies, practices, and institutions. All of our featured speakers have put equity first in their careers and their passions. This evening, ABC's President and CEO, Diane Bell-McKoy, will be interviewing Michele Fuller, CEO and President and founder of Minerva Global Business Solutions, as well as Senior Director and Wine Ambassador for Boisset Collection, a Napa, California-based wine company. This evening, Ms. Fuller will share her firsthand experience with the unique obstacles and challenges confronted by Black women in corporate America. The conversation promises to provide an empowering toolkit for other professionals who are striving to build an equity-centered career in a corporate world influenced by structural racism, microaggressions, and implicit biases. Along with being grateful for our guests, we're also very thankful for our lead sponsor, Comcast, and we also want to thank our other sponsors without whom this series would not be possible: Under Armour Foundation, Wells Fargo, Whiting Turner Contracting Company, and Bank of America. Thank you also to our friends at Afro-American Newspapers, who are our exclusive media sponsor for this event. If you joined us a few minutes early, you may have had the opportunity to watch our opening slides, but if you're just joining us, we want you to know that throughout the evening, you can drop your comments and all of your questions into the chat box or share your thoughts via social media as well. We can be found at AB Charities on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We are excited to hear from you. Your attendance, your support this evening directly supports ABC's advocacy on behalf of Maryland's Black workers in our efforts to end systemic racism and racist practices in the workplace. Without further ado, please welcome Diane Bell-McKoy and Michele Fuller.
Thank you very much, Anike. And let me add my welcome to all of you who have joined us this evening. You are in for an absolute thrilling treat this evening and the opportunity to learn more about Michele, but not just to learn about Michele, but to learn from Michele in terms of her journey, but just all that she brings today in terms of her current business. And Anike shared that with you, but I want to share it again, because I think I said to Michele that I'm actually going to fawn all over her, that I think one of the things we don't do well is actually lift up each other. Particularly, I'm talking about Black people and lifting Black women to say how absolutely phenomenal and fabulous they are. And so I absolutely believe that. And this is a woman that should be lifted up and fabulous in terms of internationally, in terms of what she's done in her career and what she continues to do. In terms of, this is somebody that you're going to get a chance to meet and hear more about that's actually delivered over deals in terms of the companies she worked for, over millions of dollars in contracts. So you got to know that. You got to understand that this is, this is not a normal journey. This is somebody who is just absolutely phenomenal in doing that and taking that set of skills and gifts and talents. And she actually turned that into her business in 2020 in terms of, Anike identified in terms of Minerva Global Business Solutions. But it's also about providing sales coaching business. Let me be clear. I want somebody to coach me in sales that has that kind of track record. I don't know about you, but that's definitely who I want to coach me in sales. Phenomenal track record in terms of in global companies, in terms of that she's been in. And I think that's really important to make note of that again. In terms of, you're going to hear about her journey, having been in Ford Motor Company and Coca-Cola. This is just somebody who is phenomenal in terms of then she really wants to bring her journey, the lessons learned, and even some of the questions she may still have to share with all of us this evening. And that's what this is about as we talk about equity first and importance for many of you that are part of the corporate community, that are Black citizens out there that are part of the corporate community. I hope that you put your questions out there and be clear to ask Michele. For those that have been on the journey, I hope you share in terms of more about your own journey. This is about how do we help inform and grow knowledge in terms of, because this is about changing the future. This is absolutely bottom line. This is about changing the future, and it begins in these kind of conversations. And so with that, Michele, I'm sorry, I just got to lift you up, sister. I just have to tell you again, I've had the pleasure of spending some time with you prior to tonight and talking with you and learning more about your journey. And it absolutely is fabulous in terms of, I know you have a lot to share with the audience, and I want to keep talking. And so I'm going to stop and let you introduce yourself and share anything more that you want to share at this point before we begin our questions.
Sure, thank you. I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I heard we have about over 150 people who are joining, so I'm really excited about that. I want to thank you, Diane, and Anike, and Deb, and the whole team, and Marissa, for inviting me to join you tonight and to have this conversation, because it really needs to be had.
So first question I want to ask you, I do want to go back to your business ventures, because I do want you at the beginning to talk more about both of the ventures that you have launched and how you're doing those ventures right now. Because I think that's, we continue to talk about your journey, that's an important part of the conversation to talk about your business, you as an entrepreneur.
Sure. So last year during COVID, like a lot of people, I actually got laid off. And so thankfully I had flexibility to take time off, because I hadn't, I had planned, actually, right? And so I decided that I don't know if I really want to go back to corporate America right away. So I actually got a call from a former client of mine who wanted to know if I was interested in doing some consulting with their company, and I had negotiated some contracts with him before, but he was in the travel channel. So it was a business that operated in airports. And as you would imagine, 2 months later, everything went crazy. So it didn't materialize, but it made me think, well, maybe I could do that. If my client is calling me to offer me an opportunity, then maybe I should do that. So I started my coaching business, and I really spent most of 2020 just working on it slowly and getting it together. And so I essentially I help businesses and individuals develop strategies to grow their own business, and also to negotiate agreements for themselves and their businesses. And so I have a client right now that I'm working with, an African-American woman who has an apparel business that she's interested in getting off the ground and wants to do some e-commerce work. So I am helping her get that off the ground, and I'll be pitching her business to some large companies soon. And then I also do engagements like this. So speaking engagements or panel discussions. I love this type of opportunity to just have a conversation. So, and then my love is my wine business. So I joined an ambassador program last year after I decided when I took some time off, I decided I want to get my wine certification, because I've always loved visiting wineries and so forth. So I got a WSET wine certification. That's the Wine and Spirit Trust, Education Trust. And so that means I'm a certified educator. And so I do tastings, I do wine tasting events. I have a team who I help, and they facilitate tastings. We do fundraisers, we do client appreciation events. So for me, that's just a lot of fun. And it's actually the most fun I've had working throughout most of my career. So.
Thank you, Michele, for sharing that. As I said to you earlier when we talked, I was excited about her wine taking that, because I know nothing about wine. So I said, okay, I'm going to be one of your clients, because I need to learn in terms of that. But this is where I really want to begin to get into your journey in corporate America, and whether or not when you started down this pathway and very different jobs, very different corporations you've worked with, did you see yourself being in corporate America for your entire career? Was that intentional? How did you move along that pathway?
It's interesting, because I actually decided during my senior year in college that I wasn't going to go into journalism, which is what I studied and had all my internships in journalism. And then senior year, I was a business minor. I said, I got a couple of offers, journalism offers, and the pay was so low that I said, I'm going to have to borrow money from my parents, and I didn't want to do that. So I decided to investigate getting an MBA, and I got a scholarship and got an MBA. And I decided that I would leverage that to go into corporate America. And I was interested in marketing and sales because I felt like that fit my personality, but it wasn't necessarily something that I thought about doing in the long term. I was 24 years old and I just didn't want to have to borrow money from my parents, and I just wanted to be on my own, and I wanted to earn a good income. So that was really the gist of it, in the beginning. And then I started to enjoy the work, not necessarily the corporate culture, but I did enjoy the work, and I did enjoy working with clients. And so I ended up, staying in that arena for most of my career.
Can you talk a little bit more? Not everyone in our audience has been in that corporate culture, and many of those in the audience that have clearly know what you're talking about. For everyone to know, what is that corporate culture like? And particularly, what is it like for you, or was like for you as a Black woman?
So, the cultures are a little different. So starting with Ford, where I worked, that was the first job that I had, and I was there for about 5 years. It was a very traditional, primarily white male environment. And it wasn't very diverse, and it wasn't very, how do I say? It wasn't very encouraging, if you will. One of the things that I observed is that white males were oftentimes received a lot of accolades, and they were often, mentored and promoted and recognized for their work. I saw that a lot. I didn't see diverse folks getting recognized when they did the work. I don't think you should be recognized if you didn't do the work. But and I also just saw them just being protected a bit more. And just, we oftentimes didn't have those opportunities to move ahead. I was fortunate because while I was there, a new leader came who was managing our division office, VP of sales, and he saw me give a presentation at a regional meeting and tapped me for a marketing promotion. And that was great. But, and I really enjoyed it until they wanted me to go back into a similar role that I had before after about a year. And that just made no sense to me. And so one of the things I always do, like in a situation like that, is validate whether or not there's any type of performance issues, because sometimes people may think, well, I deserve this, and maybe there is a performance issue. And they say, absolutely not. You're doing great. Well, then why did I have to go back to a similar role, which, by the way, required me to travel 4 days a week, sometimes 5 every day. So I was traveling, almost nonstop. And I just didn't want to go back to that. I wanted to have more balance in my life. And they could not give me a valid reason. There was no performance. That's just the path that we want you to take. And I said, well, I don't want that. That's not the path that I want to take. So I just said, okay, well, then this probably isn't for me. So I found another job, and that's when I left and went to Coca-Cola.
So I want to summarize again, though, what you just said, again, for the audience that's had the experience and many that did not. One, what you just said is when you first went into corporate America at Ford, it was clear white men were moving up, white men were being supported, accolades, getting promotions, and the diversity, people of color, were not. And so I want to spotlight that to say, this is why we talk all the time about the importance of data, because data doesn't lie in terms of who's getting what inside of a business environment, whatever that work environment was, a corporate government, data doesn't lie. Would have clearly seen that difference in terms of however a small number of people of color were there, the difference in them getting promoted versus white men. And that's real in terms of even all the conversations today about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Next question is to make sure you ask people, what's the data say versus what's the bylaw?
Well, I'll add a caveat to that because there was a recent article earlier this year about the whole Coke situation with the lawsuit, and I was there during that time. And one of the things that the article talked about was how the data, the reporting changed, a few years after the lawsuit. So basically they went from reporting, the number of Black people in certain roles or getting promoted, or minorities, women, and other ethnicities, to multicultural. So the reporting shifted to multicultural. And what happened when that happened was that over time, when they delved into the numbers, they could see that meant that they were hiring fewer Black people, but multicultural also encompassed women, white women, women of all ethnicities, but white women were considered multicultural. And so to your point, numbers don't lie, but numbers and labels can be manipulated to tell a different story as well. And that's what happened with Coke when they found out that, when they really started delving in, that this is one of the reasons why the numbers started dropping, because there was the accountability was against multicultural, not against necessarily Latinos or Black.
Data doesn't lie, and definitions mean everything.
They do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so that's really important part of the conversation in terms of whether in corporate America or whatever sector, in terms of paying attention to that and pushing for that in terms of wherever you sit. But I want to go back a while, because there are a number of younger people in the audience with us today that are also asking the question of, so, you're now here, you've got your business, you're doing all this, but how did you prepare for this? I mean, you talked about your degree, you talked about getting opportunity, but is there anything else you did differently in terms of moving forward, in terms of preparing for this pathway that you took in corporate America?
Fortunately, when I joined Ford and Coke in particular, they had really intensive sales programs, sales training and marketing training. And so I was fortunate enough to be part of those programs. So that really taught me about some basics around my role and what I would be doing. But I mean, at the end of the day, you have to find your own style and the way that you interact with people and the way that you do your job. Also, we learned about the culture of the company. But there's not a lot that you can really do to teach someone about the culture when you're just starting out. You know what I mean? The focus is pretty much on your responsibilities. But what I will tell you is, again, I mean, even moving over to Coke, I found that the mentorship dynamic was not there for us, And so oftentimes, if you had to be proactive. So there were times when I would, schedule meetings with people and just say, hey, I'd like to talk to you and just really understand what you do and how we might interact together and so forth. So I really had to take that initiative to do that, because there isn't necessarily people who are, welcoming you in.
So I want you to repeat that again, because again, for our audiences, that as a Black woman, you saw the picture, you watched what was happening in terms of mentors were available, either formal or informal, for your white colleagues. And we're not necessarily there for, although there were programs in terms of moving you forward. But the question is, you were clear about being proactive, about reaching out to people in terms of saying, I want to know more about you. I want to know about what you do. And you also made a point earlier about being clear about your performance, asking that question so that couldn't be held up. You knew the deal, but making sure they said it to you. So talk a little bit more about you identifying the people you identified to go after, to ask them questions about the organization and what they did in an organization.
So, it oftentimes, I started out with people who were around me, because those were the people that were most accessible. But then as I met more people, at Coke, I noticed there were actually a lot of people of color at Coke. They just weren't always in the high level jobs per se. But when I had the opportunity to meet some, I would ask them to introduce me to other people in some of those roles. And so I set up lunches and just reached out and said, can we have lunch? I just love to talk to you. The senior vice president of human resources at the time was an African-American woman, and someone introduced me to her and I reached out. And so, she became a resource for me. So again, be just asking, people to make introductions too.
Michele, I want to continue to talk about your journey in corporate America because I really want you to share a story. And yes,
that's a lot of them.
I do. And I want you to share several of them because they're so informative, but they're also so very interesting. But in this journey in corporate America, you also learn in terms of as you continue to grow and be more successful in terms of bringing in the bucks, the bottom line for the company in terms of what you were able to bring in. Tell us more about how you were seeing once you were bringing in and changing in terms of being a major contributor to the bottom line. And were you highly respected in doing that? And were times when they may have asked you to do something different despite your bringing in those dollars?
It was weird because I think about a negotiation that I worked on at Coke. It was a pretty large one. It ended up being $100 million negotiation with a travel client that was based over in Italy that we were working with. And so we had a team of people working on it. And but I was the main one with the relationship with the client and with the relationships with our global teams and so forth, and actually developed a strategy for the whole negotiation. But there were times when I was left out, if you will. So as you can imagine, the negotiation process took about 7 months, and so we were meeting and traveling around the world meeting. And so a meeting came up in London that my client wanted to have so we can bring in all the global folks. And they said that they didn't think that I should attend the meeting, that I should stay back and work with our bottling group to make sure that our distribution network was in place for the agreement. And I was not having that. So, because I was invited to the meeting. But there was something about traveling abroad that they didn't really like. I never really could put my finger on it, but yeah, they tried to.
They didn't want you to travel abroad.
They didn't want me to travel abroad. They could go abroad, but they didn't want me to go. And they said that the feedback I got was that, well, we just need, we need someone to be back here and work with on the distribution piece, but we have a whole distribution team that does that. And the other thing, go ahead.
This was your deal.
It was my client.
Yeah. So I just wanted to repeat that again.
It was my deal. It was my client. I wrote the strategy for it. I was working on the financials with finance and legal, and I was invited. More importantly, the client invited me, and so they, so I used some language that I feel that I'm being targeted. Mm-hmm. And when it is my client and my deal, and I need to understand why, and maybe we need to bring in a third party from HR and discuss it. And so after I said that, they said, go ahead and get your ticket. Go ahead.
I want you to talk more about that, because when we talked together, you also gave some real clear pointers, because I know from women I've talked to, Black women I've talked to, that not everybody feels like they have voice inside of where they work, whether it's corporate or not. And I know factually, actually, that voice in terms of silence creates shame and creates trauma, and it's not okay. And there are lots of fears that go into that about speaking up, about asking the question. You have some real clear advice for people about what you want to make sure you're doing in terms of your own documentation, your own journey.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that you and I talked about is I think it's so important in those spaces that you do a really good job of documenting. That means, if you're having conversations with people and you align and you agree, and even if you don't align and agree, that you just recap it. It's just recapping for everybody, and just keeping track of things, making notes for yourself, even if you're not sharing it with dates and times and things like that. You don't always have to do that for every little thing, but it's really important. So for example, going back to that negotiation process, I mentioned that I created a strategy document, in terms of how we were going to manage it. And so at every milestone, every touch point, I documented it, so that if something came up, or because people get amnesia, whether purposely or not, I could pull that out and say, no, this is what happened. This is where we align. That's not what happened, also for the client if need be. But those are the types of things that I did to protect myself, because I was accused of stuff. You didn't do this or whatever. This is my follow-up when I did that. And you actually said that you supported it. So, there are times when you have to do that, when I've had to whip that out on many occasions. So I think that's one thing. I wasn't always, and early on when I was in my 20s, I didn't always speak up, in the case that, when I was at Coke and I was frustrated because I didn't want to go back to a similar job, I just found another job. I said, well, this is then not the organization for me. But what happened with me is I started to get angry. I started to get angry. And so I said, well, I can't be in this space coming across like the angry Black woman. Mm-hmm. So I always made sure that I tried to, I kind of developed this approach of walking people to their demise. So asking questions and then following up. And then, especially if I believe that they were being disingenuous or, playing games. So, but I believe that documentation is very, very important. I do, especially in corporate America.
But I want to explore further, even because we hear a lot about it. I've been doing nothing but reading in terms of just trying to continue collectively ABC's journey, focusing on how do we help Black workers in terms of impacting that issue of dismantling structural racism, because we're clear that keeps Black workers from economic mobility. Yeah. And so, how do you deal with the emotional impact and sitting inside of any environment where you know that you're not valued necessarily the same as somebody who is your colleague who may be doing less work than you, but valued more even? How do you deal with that emotionally? What are some of the things you might want to share with the audience about how do you deal with that?
I thankfully, I always had, friends or other women in the organization who maybe weren't necessarily in my group, because oftentimes in those spaces, I was the only woman and definitely the only African-American woman, especially as I started doing work globally. But I could always call somebody and have conversations and sort of work it out. But also, even just physically, I just go work out, or if you might need to see a therapist, seriously, because it can be very, it can be a tough thing to deal with. It's not easy because you can feel isolated, especially when you are essentially by yourself and in those spaces. Fortunately, I was very blessed because I always had great relationships with my clients. Mm-hmm. And so they always, supported me. And that was great because many of them were white men, and they were very, complimentary of my work and would say, where, Michelle needs to come, or, where's Michelle? And so, I just remember this one incident when I had to go to a meeting in Milan, and another one they didn't want me to go to. And it was me and basically 12 white men, me and 12 businessmen. And I walked in a little bit later than everybody else, and I could see they were being cordial, but no one was really talking very much because it was part of the negotiation process. And as soon as I walked in, all the Italian men started, "Oh, Michelle's here, Michelle's here." And I looked and I could tell that they didn't like that. They didn't like that. So, but I always made a point of relationships are very important, and it's hard for them to come after you when your client is supporting you.
You said that across everything you just talked about, from relationships with other women, relationships with other Black women, relationships in terms of making sure you've got the support system, whether it's inside, outside, in terms of the best you do, in terms of that makes your client, in terms of one of your advocates, in terms of because you've built those relationships in terms of making that work. But the other thing you said about that emotional space is being clear about that, exercising, talking about it, and if need be, seeking therapy. And because sometimes we forget that it's not something you can always manage those challenges emotionally, and there's nothing wrong. And I think I am so excited that we have reached a time in this American society that we understand what happens for Black and Brown people every day, the trauma that happens as a result of that structural racism has a price. It has an absolute price on our health, an absolute price, both emotionally, physically, in terms of that. And we've got to be mindful of that in terms of being self-care, being responsible for ourselves in terms of moving forward. But I want to hear more stories. I want you to share more stories with the audience. And one particular story that I'm real excited in terms of I want you to share is, again, as you are actually pulling in the dollars, your clients love you, you're doing great work, and there's a deal that's just about to close, I believe. And they actually had somebody who didn't have any significant role from your company, any significant role in the deal, but they had the nerve to go white female, to go above you as though they wanted something different. And then what happens? Tell that story, please. I think that's really illustrious around how this works. This is not just, it's how the system works to actually continue to foster in terms of not valuing Black and Brown people, Black people.
Yeah, so I was, that was actually my last job. I worked for a French consumer goods company called Danone. And I had negotiated a $20 million deal there. And it was, I'll give you just a little bit of quick background. It was to be honest with you, for me, it wasn't a difficult negotiation. You know, I had cultivated this relationship with a client who was a female, and I met her 2 years before, and we had a great relationship and really worked very well together, despite what seemed like sabotage to me. And I think I mentioned this to you, I don't remember, but long story short, you know, when you're doing these deals, you have to get a lot of approvals, especially because of the spend. And so I got my deal approved, went all the way up to our division president. He approved it. I presented it to the client. The client, you know, wanted me to make a few modifications and come back, and I did. And at the beginning of the meeting, she says, "Listen, I don't have a lot of time. You know, if you were able to make the modifications we talked about, I'm actually going to give you more of the business today, okay? And then we're just going to move on." And I was shocked because one, we were not the share leader. They were taking product away from Coca-Cola. I took a lot of business from Coca-Cola, which is somewhat bittersweet. And so we were moving on. The client, you know, made that commitment. And then, so I'm back in my office working on the revisions and so forth. And I find out from my manager that my division president did not get approval from our global president, who had made some financial parameter changes. And he claims he didn't know about it, but I later found out that it was announced 8 months prior. Long story short, they said I had to rescind the offer after I had already, yes, they said I had to rescind the offer. And then they wanted to, then everybody wants to come in, everyone wants to go to the meeting, and we're going to tell the client didn't know them. And they wanted to sort of blindside the client, you know, and all of that. And I called the client. I said, "Look, let me tell you what's going to happen. This is what is getting ready to go down." I told her exactly what happened. I said, "I don't know what you're going to hear in the meeting. but this is what happened. And so she said, what she said was so interesting to me, because during the time that I was working on revisions, I asked her rather, to sign a letter of intent and about of the program. And she didn't do it. She kind of put it off. And she said, geez, if I had signed that, you would have been legally bound to give me that program. And I said, absolutely. And so, but, I just want to stay, I want to continue working with you and so forth. Anyway, she ended up giving me the business.
All right.
She still gave me the business. It wasn't as much as the second go round, but it was what I originally was trying to get, which was significant. It made that customer the second largest customer in the division. Okay. And so, so going back to the point you wanted me to talk about. So we got through all of that. I'm working on the contract. The client has the contract for signature, and then it will come back to us to sign. During that time, a colleague of mine who managed the New York market only, okay, this was a national customer, actually a global customer, largest in their retail division in North America, largest travel retailer. She came to me and wanted me to add another package to the program. She wanted me to change a few things just for New York. And I said, well, I'm not doing that. We're done. We're not making any changes. And after what I went through, I am not bringing that. I'm not reopening this deal. The deal is done. So she went over my head, went to my manager, our VP of sales and all that, and wanted them to basically, tell me to do that. And so they called me in and they said, she wants this. And she said, basically, you're not being cooperative, And so I said, okay, so let me give you the scope, because I'm about the numbers. So what she represents of this contract is 2% of a $20 million deal.
2%.
Right? So 2%, right? Over 4 years. So do you really want me to open that up for that? Because here's the thing, let's look at her performance. She's down 25% in her business and has been for a while. She's not pulling in her numbers. And so what she needs to do is she needs to go get some business of her own and not hijack mine. But if you want to reopen this, then what I will say to you is, as you know, anytime you reopen something, then that gives the client another opportunity to negotiate and ask for more. Okay. So you're opening yourself up for a greater investment than you want to make. So if you want to do that, I am going to document that I do not recommend that and what the consequences of that will be. And then you own it.
And?
Never mind. That's what I was told. Never mind. Okay.
Powerful. It's a powerful story in terms of somebody actually had the nerve to actually ask that of your superior in terms of that. And then somebody literally had to come to you to ask you to do that for a white female.
Well,
and an economic issue.
And again, it was, the feedback was you're being uncooperative. Even though I just brought in the second largest customer in the division, but I was being uncooperative.
That's a really important story to be told. And because I know there are lots of stories out there like that, but I also know there are a number of people that don't feel comfortable sharing those stories.
Right.
Wherever they are inside of a business, whether it's a corporation or not, in terms of being able to put that out there and finding ways to address it, finding ways to not just have to swallow it. And I think I just go quickly in terms of somebody said, and you did all of this you've done, and also maintaining a high level of integrity. And I think that's really important to lift up in terms of who you are. And I apologize because I've been trying to take notes of other questions I want to ask you as you're talking. And so it's not that I'm not listening, I'm trying to put down other things I want to ask you, because I think it's so right with information to share about this in terms of equity. But let's continue to talk about your journey when you begin to realize that, not sure I want to continue to stay in the corporate space, or just thinking about what else. You shared that at the beginning a little bit about what happened in terms of the layoff and that, but you also had some intentionality, some planning you were doing, some things you were doing, investing in yourself even before this particular time.
Yeah.
I thought that was very powerful, and I don't think many people think about that. If they do, I think it's worth repeating for you to share your own journey when you begin to think about your own self, your own future, and investing in that.
So when I was starting to get, disenchanted in corporate America, which was, fairly early in my career, I said to myself, okay, so I do this a lot. What is the end game for me? Why am I here, and what am I really trying to do here? And just in general, right? What's my goal? My goal was not to get titles. I was not aspiring to be the president or even a VP or any of that. I really wasn't aspiring for that. I was very clear that I was there to earn a living, and I was there to earn, a good living. But I also, based on the behaviors that I saw and the lack of support. Now, I will say, as I said before, there were people periodically who were supportive. There was like the gentleman at the division VP who hired me or positioned me for that role. And there were other people who were supportive. But largely, there was a lack of support. And so what I realized was that I can't rely on this long term because this could go away. So I started investing in real estate, in Baltimore, actually. So when there was the Coke lawsuit, when that happened and I was part of it and I got a little settlement and it wasn't that much money, I put a down payment on a rental property because I said, I need to have something else working for me, in case. And also because I just could not put all of my eggs in that basket because at any time they could just decide they want to get rid of you. Mm-hmm. And so then I started looking at what are some of the opportunities that I have while I'm here to maximize that. And I just took advantage of it. So at that time, they were giving us stock options, right? So I kept them and I saved them. And I made sure that, I really put together a plan for myself because I really wanted, at the end of the day, the only reason why I was doing all of this, besides I needed to eat, right, and have some shelter,
it wasn't
is I wanted to have some financial independence one day. You know what I mean? And I didn't want to be beholden to a company to tell me what to do. And so when I started, at one point, when I started, looking at other opportunities, I'll be honest with you, I looked at, there was a time I'll never forget when I was going to apply for a promotion. And I looked at the differential, in terms of the increase that I was going to make. And I had made that in the stock market the month before. So then it becomes, why do I need to do that? Because, and I'm not saying that to brag or anything. I'm just saying that I became very fixated on that piece of it because what I realized is that if I could do that, then I could make some choices for myself. So why do I need to take on another role that's going to put more pressure on me? And, I'm going to be traveling like crazy for a differential that I could make in the stock market with the right investment portfolio. Mm-hmm. Right? So the key is, for me, it was like, well, do both. Try to maximize both. And because ultimately you can have some freedom if you do that. And so fast forward many years, when I got laid off during COVID, I didn't have to go to work.
You had been intentional.
Because I was very intentional with that, right? And very intentional about, why am I here? I'm not here for a title. The title's cool. It's if you can get that, and you can, right? But then what goes along with that? And so, is that ultimately going to get you where you want to be? And it might, but you're also, reliant on that performance review or reliant on, when you're in that space, and that is all your eggs are in that basket, then you are inclined not to speak up for yourself, right? Because you feel like, well, you know, I gotta, but when you are putting things in motion for yourself on the side, then you can talk a little, you feel, or at least I felt a little more comfortable speaking up because I knew that I was putting things in motion for myself to reach some goals that I set for myself.
And so no matter what, your message still continues to be that you need to be intentional. You need to think it out. You need to think it through.
You do. And it might be that and it might be that your goal, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be the president of the company or senior VPs. I have many friends who are doing that, several. And it is so wonderful, you know? And so it just depends on what is important to you.
Yeah.
But I think you need to think through that, because I think a lot of people do things just because it looks good, but they're killing themselves and they're stressing themselves out, when the reality of it is maybe that's not, if they really think about it, that may not be the only path to get to where they, you know, need to be or want to be.
So I know that I'm mindful of the time, and I know shortly that my team's going to ping me in terms of making sure that I make time for the audience. And I know as I look down in the chat box that there's a question in terms of from the audience. And so I want to ask that question, but I want to first ask you one other question, because I think this is important for whoever is out there. And can Black workers succeed in corporate America if corporate America does not reconcile structural racism?
Well, I think that some Black people can succeed. We're seeing some of that now. You know, we're seeing a few Black CEOs here and there. And, you know, Roz Brewer, for example, you know, who's at Walgreens and used to be at Starbucks, right? So I mean, you will see Black people in executive spaces, but is it representative of all of us? You know, of when you look at the number of executives, the number who are in corporate America are very, very small. So I don't think that, you know, racism will stop us entirely. But I do think that in the absence of very clear corporate objectives around it, along with key steps at every level to achieve those goals, then I think it's going to be difficult, because a lot of what I observed was the issues were with middle managers who feel like you're a direct threat to them. So even if the company or the CEO wants to, you know, develop a program and so forth to support, or just wants to support people of color and women, sometimes you have middle managers who will throw a wrench in that. You know, on one of those negotiating trips that I went to, our, you know, senior vice president, actually he was the president of our division at Coke. He was very supportive of women and people of color, but he didn't have any idea they were trying to get me off that trip. He had no idea. So that they didn't want me to come, because that's not something that I could not have gone to him and told him that, you know? So I think there needs to be very clear plans at every level.
There are several questions that are popping up. I want to make sure that I try to get to some of those questions. And one of them that I saw very quickly, and sometimes we don't talk about this. And so I mean, real clear, nothing's taboo in terms of we're going to overcome these issues. Our own kind of internalized oppression pops out there as well. We got to own that in terms of this journey. And so there was a question that asked this question about have you run into a situation where in fact the other Black people, particularly Black women, were the ones that seemed the most cold or distant despite your reaching out? And if so, how did you deal with it? I've heard this question from other Black women at times in different locations.
So I had a situation when I was at Ford in particular, and there was another Black woman who had been promoted prior to me getting there. And there were a few other Black folks who were also working in my role. So that was the most that I had ever worked with. It was about 4 of us. And she was very standoffish. She never really, spoke to us. If, I stopped by her office to kind of try to get to know her. And she was not very open, very gracious, but kind of like, I'm just going to say hi and I'm not going to like give you anything. But it wasn't until our division VP promoted me that she came and started trying to get to know me. I didn't like that too much, but I got to know her, I gave her an opportunity. But I just think that her style was, she just didn't really want to associate herself as much, was my impression, until she felt like you had potential like she did. So, and I think that's a shame, but that does happen.
It does happen.
That does happen. And you can't manage other people, then they're just not part of your circle. They're not, it's unfortunate, but people are people first. Mm-hmm. And everybody doesn't support everybody. And some people feel that they're better served without having you attached to them,
Yeah, so, and that's about their journey, and that's about who they are. And that's not defined about who you are. In terms of, you really do have to be mindful of that. One of the questions that's here, though, there's several questions. I don't know if we're going to get a chance to all of them. But one of the questions is, how did you ensure that you had a seat at the table when it was most important?
Well, I spoke up for myself. And if I was invited, so for example, I had another situation where I was invited to speak by a client at a best practices meeting that he was having. And it was in Nice, France. And I was invited to go and speak. And I was told, they tried to kind of hijack the trip a bit. And my manager was going to go and instead of me. And I said, listen, you weren't invited. And what are you going to speak about? You don't know this is not your account. You don't know what's going on. So what I did in that instance is I reached out to the client and made sure that the client reached out to my leadership team and communicated his desire for me to go. He sent me an invitation, but I had him do that. So it depends, it depends on the situation. There's been times when I've just had to straight up say, okay, well, I'm going to have Karen from HR join us as an intermediary so that we can have a discussion.
Mm-hmm. Again, back to the intentionality of your actions to achieve your goals in terms of outcome. One question here asked a question about what would you tell, now that you've been through this journey, what would you have told your 25-year-old self?
That's a really good question. I would have told my 25-year-old self to probably speak up sooner because I didn't speak up for many years. I would kind of talk to my friends and I didn't speak up. And it wasn't until I kind of started getting angry. But the anger wasn't emotional. So let me be real clear about that. Because I in those spaces, you need to try not to be emotional. You need to address things with facts, and you need to ask questions and validate and do those types of things. So I turned that into my anger into those types of actions. And I think that was the right thing to do because it served me well and it protected me, frankly. So I would have probably just spoken up sooner for myself.
Thanks. One last question from the audience. Again, I'm keeping track of the time in terms of in what ways has your Blackness helped you in the workplace? Not talking about affirmative action, but rather elements of your culture or experiences allowed you to do something different or better.
Well, being raised a Black woman in America, a lot of times we're taught that we have to be better, that we have to work harder, that we have to, we just have to do things, with excellence. And so that growing up like that and with that in the back of my mind all the time made me seek to be better and made me strategize differently. And I think it made me really better at my role and in my jobs. And also I mentioned the whole relationship dynamic. So I knew the value of cultivating positive relationships. And I knew how to do that, even with people who didn't look like me. They were some of my biggest, advocates. And so I think, I don't know if that's about, I guess the part about being Black is the cultural things that we're told, growing up on how, in terms of how we need to conduct ourselves. And that always played in my head. And for some other people in corporate America who were always hooked up and didn't really have to work so hard, what I found later in my career is that sometimes they struggled, because when you don't really have to work hard, you don't really know how to do certain things. And, I started getting actually a lot of calls from white men asking me for help in my last job, especially with negotiations. And I thought that was really interesting.
Oh, they knew that you could do it. You were excellent. So no surprise. But I want to actually be able to turn this back to you before we close out. And I apologize sincerely to our audience that we're not able to get everyone's question. And it's exciting to me that we had so many questions. And so, Michele, that's actually a tribute to you and all the value you bring to this conversation and you bring to all of us this evening. But I want to give you the opportunity to share anything you want to share before I do a closeout with the audience tonight in terms of this journey. And given what our agenda is in terms of how do we dismantle structural racism in the workforce ecosystem to change the economic outcome for Black Baltimoreans. That's our bottom line. And we believe it's absolutely critical to make those changes. But to you, what would you share with us tonight?
Just as I said before, I think being very intentional about what you want to do. I think that you have to also know the law, when you're in these spaces sometimes. You have to know, because sometimes, like, especially in Georgia, when I was working down there at Coke, it's right to work. So you have to understand, what the rules of the game are. And you just have to be really intentional about documenting, and also sometimes over communicating with managers who may not be on your side or might be sort of gunning for you. The best thing you could do, what do they say? Keep your enemies close, and really just speak up for yourself you have to be tactful, and you can't be emotional about it. And you have to just, lean on facts. So that's basically what I would say.
I want to thank you, but I also want to again thank our audience. In fact, that we're very excited about our speaker series, Equity First, and to say that we have a number of people that have made donations to us that registered for the event. So we encourage you, and if you've not made a donation and you're interested in making a donation, that you can also feel free to go to our website. This is what this is about for us. And obviously it can't be done without it being supported along the way. But I also will ask you to join us, for those that can, on Tuesday. We have a webinar that I think will be equally as exciting as today, slightly different focus, but Michele, you may be interested in this yourself.
Yeah.
And it is how to address white supremacy in the business school. We know, in terms of where the pathway, how do we address white supremacy in business school if we're going to change these outcomes down the road? And so again, I want to thank everyone for joining us, for being a part of this evening. I certainly want to thank Digital Harbor Foundation, the team in terms of Anike and Debbie. And I have to also give a shout out to Marissa Stone-Bass, who is your friend. And this is how I got to you in terms of that. So I want to actually give Marissa credit for that. But again, for all of our audience, in terms of thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of this journey, for bringing about change. Again, thank you, Michele.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Marissa.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.